So with that, let's turn to the panel, and given the size of the group, I'm going to turn to Ed Gallo with Human Dimensions and Natural Resources to introduce the group and take it from here. How's that sound?
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ed.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. So my name is Ed Gallo, as Chad introduced me. I am an assistant professor from environmental governance at the HDNR department. And it's my great pleasure today to be chairing and moderating today this session with the first ever delegation of CSU to the UN Biodiversity Convention. So has anyone heard of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the so-called COPs that are on the news quite often? Yeah. What about biodiversity COPs? Okay, fewer hands. Okay, that's great. That's what we want. We want fewer hands. Excellent. Great. So in this session, the first CSU delegation to the Convention on Biological Diversity's Conference of the Parties, in its 16th edition, will use the International Symposium to share your experiences attending this high-level global policy making meeting, report back on takeaways, and discuss biodiversity challenges moving forward. The CBD, one of the 5 Rio conventions from the Earth Summit, signed in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, including the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on the Certification, the Forum on Forests, and the main Global Treaty for Advancing Biodiversity Conservation, so-called CBD, or Convention on Biological Diversity. So with that, let's just start off then with introductions of the panel. I would like to, first of all, acknowledge all our affiliations, and importantly, the role that SOGE, the School of Global Environmental Sustainability, played in this delegation, because it was through them that it was possible to actually secure an observer status. This is a high-level meeting that is not open to anyone, and the actual way to get in is through the application to an observer status, because we are not government representatives, and that was done through SOGES. The head of delegation was Professor Chris Funk, who unfortunately for personal reasons cannot be today. He is the director of the Global Biodiversity Center at SOGES and is a professor at the Department of Biology at CSU. And I would like to also acknowledge one more person of the delegation who is not able to make it today, and that's Professor Sandra Duran. She is assistant professor at the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship at CSU as well. And with that, let's start off with actually the people who are here. It's great. So let's start off then first with Professor Liva Fischer. Yeah, excellent. And that's she's in the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Conservation Biology. Next is Professor Colleen Duncan. She is in the College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences. Dr. Vinara Mathur, he is the director of the Biodiversity Indicators Dashboard Program at Colorado Natural Heritage Program. And last but not least, we have, of course, Gillian Bowser. She's an associate professor at the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability. So without any further ado, let's get started then with today's conversation. So we're going to start probably sharing a little bit of background, and that's talking about where we are sitting, like within the broader context of global environmental governance and policy making. And that's what we would like to draw on your attention to make you think about, well, you may have heard and seen what's going on in terms of climate change negotiations. Well, now what we're going to be talking about is basically the equivalent as well. What happens in those rooms for international negotiations in the context of actual biodiversity conservation, which is like the sister agreement to the United Nations Convention. So with that, I would probably like to pass it over to some of the panelists to actually run us through a little bit of the history of how we got to COP16. It's the 16th edition of the actual Conference of the Parties, which is the decision-making body where governments get together to make decisions about how to move forward with the convention. And this shows us a little bit of the roadmap as on how we got to where we are. So over to the panelists. Thank you.
Should be using the mic or just
no?
Oh, okay. So good afternoon, good morning, or as you say in the UN world, you have to introduce in several time zones. So I think it's important to acknowledge that SOGES has been involved, and CSU has been involved since COP15, and even earlier with Michelle Betzel, I think was at COP1 or thereabouts. So CSU has been involved with these conventions for a very long time. The difference is when we get the authority. So to back up a little bit, it's important just to a little little correction on the date there, the IPCC actually predates the Rio Convention by several years. And so it's important that IPCC was an important sort of launch point of using science as part of asking the question about what is happening to the planet. So the Rio Convention, the Earth Summit, why that's really important right now, since 1992, is that we have this, what's known as the Rio Trio has come together, and that's the Convention on Climate Change, Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. So that's mostly the desert countries. The Forum of the Forest is not an official convention, so it's important to keep those straight. And why that's important is that there's this coming together of the understanding of science, plus the climate change issues, plus the role of observers all together to address global challenges. So it's important to be there as an observer, bring the science there, bring our students there, bring our voices there to look at how is the planet being challenged by global climate change. So to back up to a couple of things just to think about, since I've been going to the COP since COP 15 was my first one, we started with the Montreal Protocol. Not the Montreal Protocol, I'm sorry, Kyoto Protocol. But even before that, especially for those who worked in the Arctic, the first piece was the ozone hole over the Arctic, which was part of the Montreal Protocol. And look at the ozone in 1987. So that was the first sort of start of thinking that we need to think about what was going on and what was changing. And then in 1992 in Rio, when that was brought together, IPCC had already put some information out that we have some challenges going. We need to pay attention to these challenges, right? And what those challenges are and how the world works together. And then we moved over to Kyoto on our side. It's important to note that the UNFCCC meets every year. So we're at COP 30 for UNFCCC, whereas the other COPs meet every other year, etc.
And just to clarify, that's climate change convention.
That's
I'm
sorry.
The sister convention to the CBD, which is the
UNFCCC is climate change.
So there you go. Yeah, the biodiversity convention. No, that's great. Thank you very much for that.
Right, so they meet they have different schedules, so that's important. And COP just means the conference of the parties. And that's when all parties, not countries, come together. And it's important to recognize that because we have parties that do not own any land, like the Holy See, and we have parties that are not necessarily recognized as countries, like the Palestine territories, but they are members of the UNFCCC, so, or of the COPs as a whole. So it's just important to remember that. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but the Rio Trio is really cool right now, and it's really important for us at CSU to be members of these two conventions because they're starting to come back together. So it used to be that climate change convention only dealt with the physical environment and dealt mainly with greenhouse gases. The Paris Agreement is just on greenhouse gases. It does not include biodiversity. And then you have CBD over here with the new protocols just dealing with biodiversity. And this year they're starting to come together and say we need to have this cross conversation of what's happening with biodiversity, what's happening with greenhouse gases, and bring those together. So this is an important sort of subway. So before I turn the floor over, I think there's a couple last things to remember. And I used to call it dancing at the COP. It's important that the COP is a huge circus. It's a massive circus, but it's a circus with a purpose. So when Eleanor Roosevelt set up the UN, one of the things that's in the UN Charter is the participation of civil society worldwide. What that means is that civil society is meant to be present at every convention, right? So this is an important piece of when you look at these conventions and how they come together. Civil society has a role in every convention. The parties have their own role in the convention through the negotiation, and civil society has voice through constituency groups. So we, as a member of the RINGO, Research and Independent NGO, or the academic research constituency groups for civil society, speak to the floor through those groups. So we're not negotiating, we are the observers. That's a really important role to play. It's really important, I think, for our students to understand that role. That's very important to be there, have your voice, but your voice is not on the floor, it's someplace else. And that's an important point. So let me turn it over from there and then we can sort of dash back and forth.
I think the only thing to add to this is within the Rio Trio, the Biodiversity COP sort of came about, sort of discussing two aspects. One is digital sequencing and genetics, and access and benefit sharing. So when these issues came up, they were like, we need a protocol to talk about genetic diversity and access and benefit sharing within countries. So that's the two, Nagoya Protocol and the Cartagena Protocol. And then obviously it became bigger to talk about ecosystem services, nature's futures framework, how are people in society addressing biodiversity or interacting with biodiversity. So now the emergence is finally happening where the climate change COP sort of talks about, oh, nature has all the solutions, but the nature biodiversity COP is saying, no, we're under pressure also. And it's really important to have these two conventions talking to each other. And then these are all the subsidiary bodies to the COP, where there's a convention on protected areas, there's a convention on indigenous peoples' involvements, and the two genetic diversity and the Nagoya protocols, all combining to make the CBD COP16 international thing.
So yeah, so just to remind everyone, yeah, that the conference of the COP is the maximum authority, right, where decision making happens between parties.
The negotiating groups work year round, and that's another important piece, that they meet throughout the year.
Right.
And they bring their decisions to the COP.
To the COP, right.
is the final decision-making body. But in parallel, you have the science bodies. You have IPCC, you also have the Intergovernmental Forum for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services.
Right.
That is another large assessment that run in opposite parallel.
Right.
So they're not part of the convention, they inform the
Yeah,
convention.
okay.
So they work together.
Yeah. And then the equivalent to the IPCC, which is the maximum science authority that informs climate change, then is IPBS is the equivalent. The Intergovernmental Panel,
Biodiversity.
yeah, on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Okay. Right.
And just one last point on that's really important, that we have, I think, of the Nobel Prize winners, I think there are 4 CSU faculty who were on the IPCC at that time. IPBES is a similar, but it's a younger scientific body, scientific assessment, and the third is the GEO, the Global Environmental Outlook Report. And we have CSU people on all of those. So it's really important that CSU is actively and heavily involved, especially in the College of Natural Resources.
That we wanna, I guess, as much as the idea is to provide you with a broader understanding and context about what the COP is and what the CBD is, the Convention on Biological Diversity, I think we take also a little bit of an ethnographic approach to get a little bit of the behind the scenes and what was the personal experience as well and what it actually means to be in that meeting. And I was like so frustrated because for visa reasons I couldn't make it, and I was supposed to be as one of the panelists, so that's why I'm today interviewing the panelists, because I couldn't make it. So that's the delegation. So I don't know if you would like to speak to any of that and what that flower is, because I've seen that flower in the wild, where it's native to.
I'm the one missing from the picture, so.
Okay, so maybe you would like to speak to the photo, maybe. I don't know, maybe Colleen or Leva. No, there's nothing to share about the photo. Okay.
Yes, Columbia.
That's Chris.
Yeah,
Chris
I mean,
Funk
this
there and
is
Sandra.
us in Cali, Colombia, where the meeting took place. And so this is most of us, not all of us. Unfortunately, Julian is missing from the photo, but this is as you pull up to the venue out in front. So this is sort of the introduction. Yeah, yeah, it's a whole different experience going to this. So unlike those two have years of experience interacting with COP processes and meetings, this was brand new for me. I had never been to a COP before. It was completely different than like a scientific conference or something like that. So first of all, there are thousands of people there. Did you say there's like 7,000 there on a daily basis? 19,000 over the 2 weeks. It's 2 weeks long, but not necessarily everyone comes for the whole 2 weeks. The observers, the people who are making the decisions, of course, are there. The parties are there, but some of us are coming and going. So it's thousands of people there from all over the world. Many people are wearing country dress, so you can just see the like richness, like the cultural richness of, and for me, it was super inspirational to see people coming together from all over the world who were absolutely dedicated to biodiversity conservation in all of its forms. So that was really exciting to me, I'd just say. And then well, we can talk more about how it works, but it functions really differently than any other meeting you've ever been to too. So I'll stop there.
It's a high level, political, really decision-making body or meeting, really, with many side events that some of them may resemble a little bit more information sharing, but there is the main assembly really is about decision-making. And just a little bit of background. So Colombia is one of the 17 mega diverse countries alongside the US and many other primarily tropical countries in the world, and Colombia is one of them. And I think that means that those 17 countries harbor a disproportionate amount of percentage of the global number of species and diversity of ecosystems. And within Colombia, Colombia has the record of having the highest number of bird species of any country in the world. And that flower, speaking to biodiversity, is an endemic flower to a particular region in Colombia, in the Orinoco region of Colombia, in the eastern plains, and that's called the Nidida flower, and that's endemic to Colombia. So that made it was like a big symbol, so to the COP. And that's where Cali is, and somewhere around here to the east of Cali, way closer to Venezuela, is where that flower is native to. And that's Cali, a little bit of a tropical city. I mean, that's all in Colombia, depending upon where you are in elevation. So I think it's I still speak metric system, so like 1,000 meters. That's where I completed my undergrad, actually, by the way. So another reason for frustration, that's why I didn't make it to the meeting. And with that, let's talk a little bit. Let's take it back to the panelists to talk a little bit more about the actual COP thing.
Yeah, so I think this is what the Biodiversity COP didn't have is an official reporting mechanism up until last year. So last year, about 196 countries signed the Kunming KMGBF, Global Biodiversity Framework. This framework has 4 overarching goals. So the goal can be improved biodiversity coverage, for example. But how does that translate to countries? So then those goals are backed up by 23 targets, and those targets are backed up by thousands of indicators. So these are all the targets that the Kunming Biodiversity Framework sort of encompasses within it. I think most of us here are based in health, protected areas, natural resources, genetic diversity, but then there's all this talk about strengthening and capacity building between countries. There's urban landscapes as well as genetic resources. So that's why suddenly there is so much importance on the CBD COP, because now countries have an official metric to report every year or every 2 years that they meet. So a lot of these discussions, as Gillian mentioned, happen throughout the year, and in COP we finally present what are called National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans. And these NBSAPs now need to be sort of standardized and against a metric of these targets and these indicators of how these countries are progressing over the next till 2030 and reporting on these NBSAPs. So that's sort of the framework that drives the CBD COP these days.
So I'll jump in again a little on here. These may look slightly familiar, but this is actually very similar to the same framework as the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets within the goals. But the Sustainable Development Goals sit under the General Assembly of the UN, but they were also put together in a Rio meeting called the Rio Plus 20 years after the Earth Summit. And what's another interesting factoid, it's actually the same artist who did the Sustainable Development Goals. And you may recognize the icons who did these icons. But what's important, these are frameworks. And like the Paris Agreement set up, every country has its own nationally determined ability to address climate change. So the NDC plans is what a country itself thinks it can meet its target. And the Montreal Protocol is doing the same, Montreal Turning Protocol is doing the same thing, asking each country to come up with its plan to meet those targets. So this is a common framework now to say, here's a target, here's how each country within its capacity is going to meet that target. Rather than having a global body tell everybody you have to get to point A. It's how does each country contribute to its capacity. And then the 2 science bodies check. IPBES checks on that capacity, IPCC talks about, are we meeting what we said we would take in our national determined contribution to reduce our emissions to meet the 1.5 goal. It's actually well below 2 goals, the actual language.
Now we take probably a step back, talking about the broader 3 main goals or objectives of the Convention about Biodiversity. Would you like to, anyone, or maybe sorry to put in the spotlight, talk about the 3 main goals or objectives of the Convention?
Yeah, I think there's a slide on it, but the main goal is obviously now it has become about talking about access and benefit sharing, the 30-30 goal, which is protect 30% of the global biodiversity in the world. And then it also has become about partnerships and collaborations and how we sort of bring these 2 conventions together. So those are the 3 overarching sort of main ideas of the CBD COP, and then these indicators and frameworks sort of are embedded within the 30-30. So if you talk about, oh, let's improve our biodiversity on campus by 30%, what does that look like? What's the metric that we're gonna assess them with? And that needs to be standardized, because prior to this, there was no standardization of that. So countries are feeling this overwhelming need to report, and this is a big ask for countries. Or not all countries have the same capacity, and that's where programs like ours come in, where we're the indicators program, and we help build capacity in countries. We don't have the data to report to the CBD every 2 years, because these are mammoth tasks, and you need to have the in-house capacity, where CSU is also helping. So we're taking global or expertise from within the CSU campus and then bringing them to the countries to help fill out these gaps within these indicator frameworks.
That's why we like to call it the road to global biodiversity conservation, because at the end of the day, countries signed an agreement in 1992, but then it has taken so many years to actually operationalize it. And actually, what does that mean? To make it actually happen and to eventually have an actual impact on the ground. So anyone would like to share a few examples of, like, when we are talking about targets, what are we specifically talking about? Probably pick 1, 2 just out of a hat, just to give people a little bit more context on what those targets actually, are telling countries they should do.
I have a fun one. So Chris Funk is working on the genetic diversity indicator. So he, with Sean and other people, were part of the platform of the delegation. And you're basically looking at N number is equals to 500 for a species to have the genetic gene pool to survive X amount of time and to have the genetic resources within that gene pool. So what does that population look like? How does it migrate within country? How do land barriers not let that migration of the genetic resource happen throughout the conservancies? And this is an example from Namibia. So we're basically working with in-country data to help report on the genetic biodiversity between the big 5 within Namibia. So that's one very minute example of the whole target.
So I'd say the one goal that overlaps quite a bit is the 30 by 30. So in the Sustainable Development Goal target, it's Sustainable Development Goal number 15, on what percentage of the land is put in protected status, across the world. And protected status is defined differently depending on where you are in the world. So it's really important to recognize that. For some countries, that protected status includes people within the boundaries of a protected area. Some countries have porous boundaries, some do not. So what protected status means. So the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal number 15, matches in many ways this goal, which is number 9, I can barely read it.
Manage wild species sustainably.
Right, but they're 2 different goals. So it's important just to see how these move in conjunction. So countries, the other thing about the goals is follow the dollar, right? So they're funded by the World Bank. The World Bank tries to match the targets of the framework. So you can apply to the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, to the GEF, to all these bodies to meet the goal for any country. So it's important for a country to be able to articulate, I'm going to meet this goal by this, I'm going to apply to Green Climate Fund to set aside 30% of my land, and that meets my target as a country, right? So it's within your country's target, your country then applies for the funding. And it's an important shift that every country has that individual determined responsibility.
So a lot of the expansion of the protected area state around the world has been driven and framed by the Convention on Biological Diversity. So just to give you another example of what a concrete action the CBD has meant on the ground.
Can I just add something to that? So one thing I really appreciated though is that a lot of the news focused on the 30 by 30 goals and that target, but there's so much more and it encompasses all of the landscapes on Earth. So I went to sessions focused on urban systems. We're also focused on sustaining biodiversity and human well-being in urban systems. So, you know, Paris has made a commitment to green roofs, like every new building needs to have some proportion of the roof is a green roof or solar panels, you know, and I just appreciated that there are also whole groups focused on sustaining biodiversity in farmland and agricultural systems as well, and in partnership with developing energy resources. So it's not just about protected areas, it's about like the full landscape too.
Right. Yes, please.
Which countries is CSU working with? We've heard about Namibia.
Okay, so yeah, our program works with 7 countries. So previously has worked with Uganda, Ghana, the Arctic Coalition, and then currently working with South Korea as well as Bahamas. And then each country has a different capacity and a different sort of goal and target that they want to achieve. So we're trying to build out what is the monitoring frameworks for each country to help report to the CBD in the next cycle. And that's where our technical capacity comes in.
Okay, so that's the Natural Heritage Program. What about CSU more broadly? Are CSU professors actively engaged in helping countries to do these national?
That's an interesting question. You know, I think part of the issue is we're there as observers, right?
You're at the meeting as observers, but then the world goes on and these countries have to do their work.
Right.
So are there engagements or not really?
Well, here's the important point. Countries want to have their own capacity to meet that. So it's easier for a country to get funding for capacity within its country or to build it within its country's capacity, not to fund an external university to do the work. So I think that's an important part of this sharing, is that our job as a university, like I go there mostly for the students. Right, so we work in a partnership with students, and our job is so that students can see how other students, their colleagues, work together. So it's an education goal for any country that's working together. It's a real important point about country self-determination. There's a big motion for Action Africa, for Africa to have its own capacity, and that we share our research and we share our benefits. Right, so for us as a developed nation, our big thing is under which agreement it's called the Research and Systematic Observation Data Sharing Agreement. It's a work program under both conventions that says, all right, developed countries, you need to share that platform with any country that applies to, like early warning for drought, heat indexes, all that. So it's much more about sharing than a university helping a country. It's really about a country helping itself.
Yeah, but bringing students here to train them or to get them together, or there could be other ways to do this.
So yeah, I think where CSU is providing a lot of expertise is in the IPBES sort of global framework on the science that is leading all of these indicator work. So we contribute in a way
the science
of like, this is the indicator, this is the science behind the indicator. Now countries need to take country data and run it through that science. And we're very unique position where none of the work that the country owns all of the data. We just provide the expertise and we hand over all of the data and the platform back to the country. And the whole idea is to build this sort of capacity within the country so that you don't rely on resources from outside, and obviously money talks. So what the number is that there is a $700 billion deficit in the global biodiversity space, and countries are supposed to match it. So the idea is Brazil, in this same space, said that why are we negotiating on this, and why does it take us so much money to come to these conventions when nothing is decided? And countries that have come here don't come in good faith. So there's lobbying, there's all this global politics that drives the money or behind the meat of the matter. So right now, I think in Rome, this conference finally ended as like 2 weeks ago, and they committed to $200 billion to kind of fund for the next 5 years to have this fund dedicated to biodiversity conservation. So yeah, that's the developed country role as well.
So yeah, so thank you very much for that very topical question. I think that part of the conversation is how the CSU faculty community can be more engaged in this process. So let's move a little bit more to talk about the in and outs and the behind the scenes of the meeting. Would you like to provide, I mean, probably we could go, for a round, panel by panelist talking about, what you do for your research, why did you end up going? Was it your first time? What were your takeaways? Let's do a little bit of a roundup to hear from each panelist about that. So Liva, please, over to you.
Sure. Yeah, so my research, I'm a conservation biologist, and so really focused on island systems and then also human dominated landscapes, so places where people are. And I was just really excited to go because I only had like a vague notion of how global environmental policy or biodiversity policy worked. And I wanted to be able to go to bring that experience back to my students. I teach a large class on biological diversity and upper division classes on conservation biology. So I wanted to bring that back to my students. I also wanted to better understand like what the science needs were that maybe I could help contribute to. So much as the conversation just unfolded here. For me, one of the most exciting things about this, well, first of all, the first 24 hours, I was like, I have no idea what the heck is going on here. Like I just kind of wandered around aimlessly trying to understand, moving in and out of rooms, but it's neat because you can do that. It's like this giant, closed gated campus that you can move around. And so there's these large sessions, plenaries and working groups, but for me, the most exciting was to go to these smaller sessions called contact groups, where they were, that's the name, right, Megan? That they're really focused on particular issues or targets, or issues within targets, and they're trying to like hash that out among all the parties. And the parties are literally sitting around a giant, like rectangular table with the name of the party in front of them. Do you have a picture of like, that's kind of like a, there's a picture that's like kind
There
of
you
like,
go,
yeah,
maybe
so,
those, yeah.
yeah, it looks like this, and the observers all can sit kind of in the back or around. So there's the party, the representative of the party is sitting at the table, but then they have their own like people behind them that are providing that expertise, because they might be part of like, I don't know, like they're part of the government contingent, but they have like scientists who are also, and other people from their country that are helping provide the subject matter expertise for that topic. And so there's a lot of like side conversations, but the countries would kind of, or parties would speak up and contribute. And then sometimes if they couldn't come to agreement, because they need to come to consensus, like on every word. So it's like the document on track changes is up on the board and they're hashing through every single word. I mean, imagine trying to come to consensus on every word. And so when then they can't, then the people who are moderating this session, which is always, I think, coming from either a country that's in the north and a country that's in the south, and they try to have a good gender balance as well. They will then send groups out into friends of the chair, is that what it's called?
Informal.
Yeah.
Into the sorted
It's
out,
like
come back.
informal, and they'll be like, you go figure it out, we have to move on. So I'll stop there, but for me, that was like really fascinating to see that the policy in action, again, nothing like I'd ever experienced before, so.
Yeah, and so I am a veterinarian, and I attended partially, I've always been a Chris Funk fan, and appreciate, obviously there's huge connections between just the health of animals and biodiversity issues, but I also think that our profession has been really disengaged in biodiversity. So I partially went to sort of be a little bit immersed in the process and the negotiation, much like Liva, to be like, where does this profession fit in, but how do we bring this back to students and pieces like that? And it was so valuable. I do think though, what is really mind-blowing is it sounds very formal and rigid and official, but you actually get brought into the process, which was really interesting. So these huddles were happening, and I met one other veterinarian at the whole conference. I'm sure there were others, but I was lucky to be there during the whole negotiations for the action plan on health and biodiversity, which went late into the night. But they're having these huddles, and then pretty quickly people figure out who's there. So I was actually consulted on a few issues as part of that action plan, simply because I was in the audience, which was a bit of a mind blow. And it also makes you realize how important the science, so this may be back to your question, how important some of the basic fundamental science is and where it comes into negotiation. Because if you try to get 100% of people in a room to agree, that's lovely in many ways, and those people are fantastic. But it also means that sometimes we have a real blurring of language. And almost it becomes, perhaps less powerful in order to get that agreement. And so I think it's important to observe and understand how that happens, because I am as guilty as many, where I take these finalized documents and say, this is the way it should be, but actually a lot is often missing from that. And having seen that process, I think I really appreciate how important it is for institutions to really remain focused on the science, and just because it didn't show up in a final document, it could have been because somebody, bullheaded it, right? And just struck it down. So for me, another thing that was really an important takeaway of observing this process is how important it is for us to, even if you have sort of a wild and crazy idea, but it's valid and it needs to be built out, it needs to be defended, stay that course, and the importance of standing up for science and things like that. So yeah, I think it was fantastic to be really at the negotiations for my subject area, and I will say that I have formed relationships with people at CSU. Apparently you have to go and stay in a small apartment with 10 people in one bathroom to really come together. But also, I met random people at the conference that I'm now doing projects with. So the connections I think are also really fantastic and worthwhile. But I'll stop there. But it's a process that's hard, much like Liba, it's hard to believe until you kind of see it.
Thank you. And that's not to say, sorry, just one quick comment about the importance of that intersection and how we need to think very holistically across issues: climate change, biodiversity, human health, animal health, and what colleague was mentioned, and that's very topical when we consider that we just came out of a pandemic that most likely had its origin in the wildlife trade. So,
And can I have you go back to the?
yes, of course.
So these are just pictures of what's happening in the background, but yeah, so this is sort of what it all comes down to at the end. This is the last day of COP. This meeting starts at about 10 p.m. because the working groups cannot come to a text decision on what they want to present. So the whole text gets put up in one Google Doc and gets uploaded to the chair. And then the chair goes word by word, and all countries have to turn on their mic and say agreed or disagreed. And that process takes about 8 hours. So this meeting ran from 10 p.m. till about 7 in the morning. Through the night, people were like sleeping, crashing, crying, rejoicing, shouting, yelling. And what happens is that most of the observers are in the back, but in the front, it's all 192 countries who need to be at the table at the time. And within the CBD protocols, you kind of agree on the text of what you decided over the 2 weeks. Unfortunately, at this particular conference, they could not come to an agreement at the time. So Panama and Brazil were going back and forth, and Panama asked for a quorum to be called. And what that means is if there are not enough parties in the room at that time, the meeting is then adjourned. So at 7 in the morning, we were discussing resource mobilization, and countries were basically saying that, or the developed countries were saying that just because there is a dedicated fund doesn't mean there is action. And developing countries were saying, please commit to a dedicated fund because we don't trust you. We need some sort of validation to this whole thing where you're committed to giving us money to kind of work on this. And once that quorum was called, the chair basically said, meeting is adjourned, the buses are leaving in 15 minutes. If you want to go home, leave now. And that sort of was what is happening. They're not always like glitzy, glamoury processes. You're just sitting through them, listening to word by word. I particularly work on the monitoring framework, so it's like important for us to know if the monitoring framework was finalized, which it wasn't, and it was finalized in Rome 2 weeks ago. So that's sort of, yeah, the big. So what Gillian said earlier, these processes continue throughout the year. You just see the tip of the iceberg, which is this room in this moment.
And what are the other key places around the world where those intersessional, in between COPs meetings happen?
Nairobi hosts a lot of the SEPs, yeah, and then the CBD headquarters in Montreal right. Hosts this, and then the Bonn headquarters for UNFCCC hosts these meetings. So it's again like which countries have the money to kind of fund it. So this meeting ended without a decision on who's gonna fund the next one. And having these many people in the room, not being able to decide in that moment who's gonna even fund the next meeting or what the money is gonna come from for these people to meet again is kind of important. So it moved to the FAO office in Rome.
In Rome, okay.
So to say two things. Number one is that I spend most of my time with the UNCCC, which is about 4 or 5 times the size. So there are 100,000 people at the UNCCC. So it's there's maybe 20,000, so it's 4 times the size, all trying to negotiate. It's a couple of important things to know. One is countries negotiate by convention, by coalition. They all come into these bigger coalitions together. So the African Union, the G77 plus China, led by Ecuador, I think Ecuador is currently. So you get these crazy coalitions. That's really important. So not all 200 countries speak. They will speak with a coalition. Speaking on behalf of G77 plus China, the country of Ecuador says X. That means all 77 countries in the G77 plus China are all agreeing on this one thing. So in a bigger COP, you don't get all 200 countries. But I think the bigger issue on why I go to a COP, I've been told a lot, 15, and 5 of the, you can become a COP junkie, they really are fun. Free food, you know, it's great. But I tell my students, and I think the reason it brings students, the reason why CSU should send students, is you need to look your peer in the eye and understand what the challenge is. It's easy for us to stay here as a developed country and say it's X, Y, and Z. It's something totally different for a developing country or another country to look you in the eye and say, that's not what it is in my landscape. And our students need to understand that. I say in my class, which actually meets in 2 hours, and they may be watching, every landscape has a culture, and every culture has a landscape. And you need to look that culture eye to eye to understand where they negotiate. And our students need to understand that if they want to be leaders in this space. And you can't do that online. Unfortunately, it does mean a lot of money, but to stand in that space, stand in the pavilion for the country of Senegal and talk about flooding. Or go to the country of Barbados and talk about sea level rise, right? And the country at its pavilion is saying its story. And you probably don't have a clue what that story is, being from Colorado ski country, right? So this is so important for us to be effective in this international space, to understand every country's position and why that position is different. So that's why we take our students there all the time. And we usually take, there's a group of 15 universities, we take our students together. We're trying to get to Brazil, which is going to be a challenge, but it really is so important for students to be involved and to meet their peers from across the world and understand what climate change means to them.
How are we doing with time? Do we have
15.
Oh, okay,
15. How do we feel for questions? So do we have time to do a last round of comments from the panelists before we move on to Q&A? Are you okay with the last round? Yeah. Okay.
We do have questions
Oh,
online
questions?
also.
Yeah. Okay. So let's kick off then the questions. Sure. Yeah.
Do you have one online?
Yeah, I have a couple actually. So the first one is actually from a while earlier in the presentation. It's how does biodiversity impact greenhouse gases and vice versa?
Repeat the question.
How does biodiversity impact greenhouse gases and vice versa?
Oh, that is a wonderful question.
Yeah.
Who are my students? Two
This
things.
is-
The IPCC AR6 report that came out talks about what is Mother Nature's capacity, or actually to speak in the language of the UNFCCC, what is Mother Earth's capacity? Because the country of Bolivia insisted that Mother Earth is the language that we're talking about because nature has a culture. So what is Mother Earth's capacity to remove greenhouse gases? It's about 40%, right? So if we look at the IPCC report, if we track what Mother Earth can remove, if we leave her undisturbed, or if we allow her to function at her capacity, it's quite high on the gases. So we need to meet these two numbers. What can nature do? And this is where nature-based solutions came from. And this is a critical part with the CBD, because everyone's like, yay, nature-based solutions, let's solve it with nature. Let's go out and plant mangroves. Yeah, cool, plant more mangroves, we'll save it. But which species of mangroves makes a difference? And this is where biodiversity comes in. do you just plant palm oil, or do you plant the correct species of tree that belongs there? Do you just restore the tree, or do you restore everything? So this is where these two come together to really bring those greenhouse gases down. That's where the 30 by 30 comes in. You gotta bring that 30% of land protected, but it needs to be in protected status such that it can function to remove that carbon back down. And that's where those two numbers approach. They're really good.
No, yeah, and that's exactly the point of having these two conventions to talk, where global greenhouse gases and forestry are like the two major sink and carbon pools of each of the system. And you can't sort of focus on one without talking about the other one. So in the climate COPs, finally, the discussion is bringing forests into the language of solutions. But here, forests are under jeopardy and stress of their own. So if the climate COP doesn't talk about what is happening with the forest in the reality, and if it's the right species, where it's being planted, is the survival rate high enough, and all of those things come together to clip the GHG global house and the total protected area coverage.
Awesome, thank you. That was John Heisel, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Since you asked, and John has another question. Can you please explain more what this means? Every landscape has culture and culture has landscape.
Okay.
No, you.
Oh, no. So the short answer is that just think about the difference between desert landscapes and forested landscapes. People who grow up in a desert know about water conservation. It's part of your life, right? You live in that landscape. You want to think about this, the United States, think about us in ski country versus the people in Florida. So your culture is embedded in that landscape. If you go to Baku, which is where the COP 29 was in Azerbaijan, everything has pomegranate on everything, right? Absolutely everywhere is pomegranate. That's part of the culture, but that's part of the landscape. It's a semi-arid desert, dry, it's not a sea, it's a lake, that country sits on since before the Silk Road. So we're talking about very old cultures sitting on that landscape. So it's important for us to recognize that our culture is embedded in our landscape. What food we eat, what species we celebrate. Do we like the hot? Do we like the cold? Do we like the mountains? Do we like the sea? But we tend to forget about that when we negotiate. So it's really important. The other thing is that countries in the UNFCCC and CBD will form coalitions around landscapes, not politics, landscapes. So you'll see the mega diverse countries come together, and they could be on all different continents. You'll see the forest coalitions come together, the coalition of small island states. These are all countries that come together because they share a resource. It becomes more important when we look at migratory species that cross country border. I think birds, I think the Arctic tern is still the record for crossing, 100 and some odd countries. So the countries that see across that is important to put together. And lastly, it's important to think about landscapes and cultures in that we forget about fish. And fish is probably one of the biggest unifying cultural things out there because they cross massive numbers of, think of a tuna. One tuna fish can cross so many countries, right? So that unites those countries around that species, around their politics, around that species. And the fish treaties get that. It's just matter for the climate change community, start thinking that way. That's a good question.
Thank you. Would you like to elaborate on it? Very good. Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please.
What opportunities are there for students to join these delegations to the youth?
Ooh,
Sorry, what happened?
What opportunities are there for students to join these delegations to the youth?
amazing opportunities.
Yeah, tons.
Please go. Well, so the tricky part, as we mentioned, is that we're observers, which means that you have to have permission. And Alita is in charge of all that. She'll probably throw something at me if I say everybody should go. It's you have to have permission from the UN, right, to actually go. And so CSU has permission for both conventions to send observers. Those tend to be restricted to 1 or 2 badges. Don't get discouraged, because the nice part about the COPs is that they have 2 zones. There's a negotiating zone, and then there's the countries zone. And that whatever country the COP is in owns that zone. So in Calais, Colombia owned the green zone, and the other zone is a negotiation zone. So what that means is the opportunity to meet your peers in that country is huge, in the green zone. But maybe you should talk a little bit more about.
Well, I was just gonna add, if you're a CSU student, there's a lot more opportunity for the biodiversity COP than the climate COP. So like kind of thinking of the size issue, right? So the climate COPs have become increasingly restricted and our badges are very limited. But we have a lot of opportunity to send students as long as they have a faculty mentor that's attending with them. There's
I think-
opportunity to go.
Yeah, to add to that, there are also opportunities like beyond the campus. So there are a lot of like, there's a global biodiversity youth network called GIBIN. There's another organization called Youth for Nature. There's the Youngo consortium that supports the UNFCCC COP, and all of these sort of bodies are self-organized, youth-led, youth-mobilized, trying to basically limit the barrier to entering these spaces. So if you have a project, if you want to get associated with any of these networks, they have their own badges, they have their own funding, and their whole mandate is to get more young people through the door of these spaces. And the idea is that young people need a seat at the table, we need to amplify these voices. It's our future that is being negotiated on the table or in these meetings. So that's sort of the other avenues to kind of explore, to get associated with like global youth movements, to find badges and money to get involved in these
Definitely come
spaces.
talk to us, yeah.
Yeah.
But also just say, because there are a lot of women in the room, the women's network is the oldest. A lot was funded by Eleanor Roosevelt. The Women in Gender constituency is probably one of the strongest. The Commission on the Status of Women is meeting right now in New York. So there are lots of ways, sorry guys, but there's lots of ways for women to get involved, because Eleanor Roosevelt really put the foot down that everybody needs to be engaged in the UN. So the women's group is the oldest. The Commission on Status of Women is on 72, I think. So it's met every year since 1945. So it's 50 years older than the Climate Change Convention, put it in that perspective. So yeah, get involved. There are lots of ways. Now the COP has more opportunities to be involved virtually. To even just getting involved with a virtual match, you can see the processes and understand. I would say it's my 15th COP and you're still discovering something new. They're really hard to track. You've been to several now, and you could say each time you go, you learn more. So I would say get involved. It is your future. And we need all the voices there.
Sometimes you have to kind of be on Zoom while you're there also, just because the rooms are so small that they cannot take the people in the room. So you're sort of listening in from the outside. So anyone can sort of, tap into these conversations.
Any other questions?
Yeah, there's more from online, but
Or online, yeah.
go ahead.
One of the issues with the climate COPs, of course, is all of the private sector folks that are there, fossil fuel, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not seeing evidence of that here in your pictures.
There is a lot less of it at the Biodiversity COP. I think just because the amount of money is being talked about is smaller in the grand scheme of things.
It's much smaller.
And the influence is much smaller as well, because these are sort of like pure academics really trying to find the change and like the good in the society. I think the CBD or the CCC COP has sort of become this another beast where you can find lobbying being happening, or petrol states sort of giving a lot of money to have them hosted. I think even here, week 2 is sort of businesses that are allowed to enter the negotiation process and like listen in, but they're coming from the nature-based solution angle, or like how can we maybe greenwash or like have the language be the same as what is globally is being talked about. So that's one way, but yeah, in the CBD space, I think it's a lot less of, I think the only thing that sort of maybe proves it is the next one is in Armenia. So there is influence of like who gets to decide where it's going to be.
Just a quick follow-up on UNFCCC. Has Christiana Figueres been invited to CSU?
I do not know. She's no longer there.
No, I know.
Yeah, but I don't know. That's a good question.
She's a superstar.
She is amazing.
She ought to come to CSU.
Could invite her, yeah. I wanted to comment though more on that.
We'll follow up on that, and for the sake of, we're gonna take one last question, because I think we'll need to be, within your time, so thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Ali Raza says, thank you for your presentation and reflections. My question is, how have your pedagogies and the way you engage in global biodiversity conservation evolved since attending COP16? want me to read that again?
I can speak to that a little bit. So, yeah, so I've taught 2 classes since attending, and in both, I talked about just my experience attending this event, because I don't know if this has ever been said explicitly, but the US is not a party to the biodiversity COP. Like, so we can go as observers, but we don't really have a seat at the table, the negotiating table. And so I think it's really important for students here to understand that. So the roles that we can play, like around science and such, in education, but we don't have a seat at the table. So I've talked about the reasons why that might be the case. And I think it's sometimes in the US, can be a tendency to be kind of insular, like we're a large country, it's easy just to talk to other people who are based here and not do what Gillian emphasized, like talking to your peers around the world. So I wanted to bring that to my classroom. And just from informal conversations with my students, I think most of them were not at all familiar that there were these broader global conversations going on around biodiversity, and that we, as the US, were not a party to these conversations for biodiversity. So that's one thing that I've done.
Just add, in addition to bringing things into your own classroom, and this kind of comes up to your original question, how can we engage students in these processes without flying them around the world? There's carbon footprint, there's a huge economic cost, there's equity issues on even who gets to go. So that's something that, like with Alita and Sojas and just brainstorming, I think in general, it seems that students are interested a lot more in advocacy training and skills and engagement and engaged learning. And so in addition to how you wiggle it into things that already exist, thinking about what new things do we have to do? So we can't all travel to these amazing events, but they're on Zoom. So how can we get people together and follow them here and sort of build some community that's observing or learning about these processes in a less resource intensive way, or just to get more people part of that conversation. So I think that's the other piece in terms of learning, is how can we bring these opportunities logistically to students.
And that's an awesome segue for our last plugin. As part of all these processes going on, we are working to develop a brand new course, a brand new summer course, 2-week long in Europe, starting 2026, on international environmental governance. And we're going to be spending 1 week in Bonn and 1 week in Geneva. And that's going to be between Minora and I taking the students to Europe to actually see firsthand the headquarters and the secretariats of many of these conventions that are headquartered in Bonn and Geneva. Yeah. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your feedback online and on the QR code. And I just want to highlight, we've been thrilled to be partnering with Sojas as well. Everyone is invited at 2 o'clock later today to join a program that Sojas has pulled together called Celebrating Diana Wall, a global legacy of scientific innovation and impact. That will be starting at 2 p.m. in Ballroom D, the windows side of the ballroom, plus there will be an online link for that as well, reception at the end of that. With that, my last thank you is to our panelists. Please join me in saying thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful.